Ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear about one thing. Anger is not inherently bad. It's a biological signal. Your nervous system's alert that something feels off, unfair, or threatening. But the problem arises when anger becomes automatic, when other people gain the power to hijack your emotional state. If you want to stop getting angry or bothered by anyone, you don't need to suppress your emotions. What you need is a system, a set of internal tools grounded in neuroscience and behavior that gives you control over your response, not just your reaction. Let's start with the basics. Your brain and nervous system are constantly scanning for threat. When someone says something offensive, disrespectful, or simply annoying, it's your limbic system, especially the amygdala, that gets activated first. This system doesn't think, it reacts. It prepares you to fight, flee, or freeze. But here's the truth. The prefrontal cortex, the area behind your forehead, is designed to regulate those limbic responses. When properly trained, it gives you the ability to observe emotion without being owned by it. So how do we train this system? First, use your physiology. Deep, deliberate exhalations, longer than your inhales, send a signal to your brainstem to downregulate stress. This isn't theory, this is hardwired biology. Second, build what's called limbic friction. This is the delay between the stimulus, someone bothering you, and your response. The longer that delay, the more control you have. You can build limbic friction through breathwork, mindfulness, or even deliberate exposure to discomfort, like cold showers or controlled fasting. Why? Because you're training your nervous system not to flinch. Third, upgrade your inner narrative. You don't need to make everything about you. Someone's rude comment? It's likely a reflection of their own suffering. Your ability to reframe their behavior from personal attack to data point is what gives you peace. Finally, develop a sense of autonomy. You do that by choosing to focus only on what's in your control, your breath, your posture, your attention, not what others say or do. Over time, this gives you an internal buffer zone, a kind of psychological immunity. You can't stop people from being irritating, but you can stop them from controlling your state. You can become the kind of person who observes chaos without absorbing it, not because you're emotionally numb, but because you're emotionally trained. Anger starts as a biological signal, not a moral failure, not a personality flaw. It's a hardwired response rooted deep in your nervous system. When someone says or does something that feels threatening, disrespectful, or unfair, your limbic system, the emotional machinery of the brain, activates automatically. Specifically, the amygdala detects perceived danger and sends a cascade of signals to trigger a stress response. Heart rate increases, pupils dilate, and cortisol and adrenaline begin to flood the system. This happens within milliseconds, often before you're even consciously aware of it. Now here's the important part. This response isn't designed for modern life. It evolved to deal with immediate physical threats, predators, physical harm, survival challenges. Today, it gets activated by words, tone, emails, or even just facial expressions. The system doesn't differentiate between a lion in the wild and a sarcastic coworker in a meeting. It just senses and threat and fires. But you're not at the mercy of this process. That's because there's a higher order system, the prefrontal cortex, that has the ability to observe and modulate those limbic reactions. It can downregulate the amygdala, recalibrate your response, and allow for context and reason. The key is awareness. Once you understand that anger is your biology doing what it's built to do, not your identity, you can begin to build control. You can separate the signal from the story. You can feel the surge, but not follow it. And that separation is where real emotional freedom begins. Training the prefrontal cortex is about building your brain's ability to intervene consciously between stimulus and response. It's the part of the brain responsible for executive functions, planning, impulse control, emotional regulation. And while it develops naturally through experience, you can accelerate and refine its capacity with specific, repeated practices. One of the most effective ways to do this is through deliberate self-observation. Noticing your internal state in real time creates a feedback loop between your conscious mind and the deeper, more reactive parts of your brain. For example, when you feel irritation rising, simply labeling it anger, frustration, agitation activates the prefrontal cortex and starts to reduce activity in the limbic system. This isn't just psychological, it's neurological. That act of labeling recruits higher-order circuits and begins to soften the intensity of the emotional response. Another powerful method is mindfulness, not as a vague concept, but as a structured protocol. Even 10 minutes a day of focused attention on breath or bodily sensations increases the density and connectivity of neurons in the prefrontal cortex. Over time, this leads to better emotional regulation, faster recovery from stress, and reduced reactivity. You're literally building a stronger internal buffer. You can also engage the prefrontal cortex through behavioral consistency, waking at the same time, exercising with intention, setting and meeting small goals. Every time you delay gratification or override a knee-jerk impulse, you are reinforcing the neural pathways that favor conscious choice over automatic reaction. This isn't about willpower in the traditional sense, it's about neuroplasticity. You're not just deciding who you are in the moment, you're shaping how your brain will respond in the future. Most important thing to remember is that the prefrontal cortex isn't a passive observer. It's a muscle you can train. And the more you train it, the more space you create between provocation and action. That space is where composure breath is the only part of the autonomic nervous system that you can control both consciously and unconsciously. That makes it a unique access point to shift your internal state in real time. When you feel anger rising, your breathing pattern almost always changes, typically becoming shorter, shallower, and more erratic. This is a direct reflection of sympathetic nervous system activation, your body gearing up for confrontation or defense. But here's the powerful thing. By deliberately changing your breathing pattern, you can send a signal back to the brain that says, I'm safe, I'm not under threat, and your brain will listen. One of the most effective protocols is to extend your exhalation longer than your inhalation. For example, inhale for 4 seconds, exhale for 6 to 8. This engages the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system, the one responsible for calming, grounding, and recovery. This isn't relaxation for relaxation's sake. It's functional. When you breathe this way, you activate neurons in the brainstem, specifically in areas like the nucleus of the solitary tract, that downshift your overall arousal level. The cascade effect includes a slower heart rate, reduced cortisol output, and decreased amygdala activity. In other words, you're not just calming down, you're changing your neurochemical state from reactive to regulated. And the beauty of this tool is that it's available anytime, anywhere. You don't need a quiet room or special equipment, just the awareness to pause and the discipline to breathe with intention. Over time, this becomes less of a technique and more of a trait, a default way of regulating your internal world no matter what's happening externally. Limbic friction is the effort required to override an automatic emotional response, especially those that originate in the limbic system, like anger or irritation. It's the tension between what you feel like doing in the moment and what you know is the better long-term action. And it's that friction, that momentary resistance, that allows you to choose your behavior instead of being controlled by reflex. What's happening in the brain is a competition between two systems, the fast, reactive circuitry of the amygdala and hypothalamus, and the slower, more deliberate circuits of the prefrontal cortex. When someone says something that triggers you, the limbic system is fast out of the gate. It wants to react instantly. But if you've built enough limbic friction, there's a buffer, a moment of pause, that allows the higher order brain regions to step in and ask, is this really worth it? Building this kind of control doesn't come from simply trying harder in the heat of the moment. It comes from training outside the moment. The best way to build limbic friction is through voluntary stress, situations where you intentionally expose yourself to discomfort in a controlled way. This might include cold exposure, high-intensity exercise, breath holds, or deliberate fasting. Why? Because each of those challenges triggers a stress response. And every time you stay calm in the face of that signal, you reinforce the neural circuits that say, when I can experience discomfort without reacting to it. The more you practice this, the stronger the circuitry becomes. You're increasing the threshold required for external stimuli to hijack your state, someone's rude tone, a dismissive comment, a stressful deadline. These used to immediately trigger a spike in your nervous system. But now, you feel it, but it doesn't run the show. There's space between the stimulus and your response, and that space is earned. It's not personality. It's not luck. It's biology that's been trained to respond instead of react. Over time, this becomes your default operating system. You stop flinching at provocations. You stop needing to prove yourself in every moment, and you start choosing your actions with clarity, even under pressure. That's the power of limbic friction. It's the internal resistance that gives you freedom. Cold exposure, when used deliberately, is one of the most effective tools to train emotional control and reduce reactivity to external stressors. It works because it creates a real, immediate physiological stress response. Your heart rate increases, norepinephrine floods your system, your breath becomes short and rapid, and your body signals, get out. But here's the critical distinction. Unlike emotional triggers from other people, this is a chosen stress. You're not caught off guard, you know it's coming. And because of that, you get to practice staying calm in the middle of intensity. This practice shifts your baseline response to stress. When you consistently expose yourself to cold water, whether through cold showers, ice baths, or even just a few minutes of controlled exposure, you're teaching your nervous system that discomfort is not danger. You're building familiarity with that sympathetic surge and learning how to manage it rather than be overwhelmed by it. In effect, you're raising the threshold at which your body flips into a reactive state. What's happening neurologically is a strengthening of the circuits between the prefrontal cortex and brainstem. The more often you voluntarily face a stressor and override the impulse to escape, the more efficiently your brain regulates your autonomic response. This doesn't just apply to cold, it generalizes. The same system that helps you stay still in cold water is the one that helps you stay composed when someone insults you, interrupts you, or tries to provoke you. And the benefits go beyond the moment. Regular cold exposure increases baseline levels of dopamine and norepinephrine, neurochemicals involved in alertness, motivation, and mood. So not only are you training your stress tolerance, but you're also creating a neurochemical environment that supports emotional stability and focus throughout the day. This kind of deliberate discomfort is a powerful tool. You're not avoiding stress. You're building a relationship with it. You're showing your nervous system that intensity doesn't have to lead to chaos. And when the discomfort is no longer surprising, neither are the people who try to get under your skin. Cognitive reframing is not just positive thinking. It's a biologically grounded way to shift how your brain interprets and responds to stressors. When someone says or does something that triggers anger, your initial reaction is shaped by deeply ingrained neural pathways, ones that associate certain tones, looks, or words with threat or disrespect. These associations often come from past experiences and are reinforced over time through repetition. But here's the key: your interpretation of the event, not the event itself, is what drives the emotional response. What's happening in the brain is a dynamic between the limbic system, which reacts reflexively, and the prefrontal cortex, which provides context and meaning. Reframing activates the prefrontal cortex to reinterpret the situation consciously, often in a more adaptive way. For example, instead of interpreting someone's rudeness as an attack, you can view it as evidence of their own stress, insecurity, or dysregulation. That shift doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it gives your nervous system a different message. And this is not about me. And that message changes the cascade of physiological reactions downstream. This isn't abstract. Functional MRI studies show that when people actively reframe a situation, activity in the amygdala decreases while prefrontal regions increase in activity. This means your brain is literally downregulating the threat response and upregulating executive control. You're reducing cortisol, slowing your heart rate, and creating internal space to choose your next move. The power of reframing lies in its repeatability. Every time you consciously shift the narrative around a triggering event, you're reinforcing new neural pathways. You're training your brain to respond differently, not just once, but over time. It becomes easier, more automatic, and eventually your default mode. You don't just try to stay calm, you actually experience less anger because the event no longer registers as threatening in the same way. Reframing is a form of mental reps. Like lifting weights or sprinting intervals, it changes your internal architecture. And the more often you practice it, the less control others have over your emotional state. You're not just resisting anger, you're rewiring your brain to make it irrelevant. Staying physically calm is not a passive state. It's an active skill rooted in the control of your body's autonomic responses. When you encounter something that would typically trigger anger or agitation, an insult, a slight, a betrayal, the body's immediate reaction is physical. Muscles tense, posture shifts, the jaw clenches, fists might tighten, and breathing becomes shallow. These are not random. They're signals of the sympathetic nervous system revving up, preparing you to fight or flee. The key insight is this: even if your mind is trying to stay composed, if your body enters a fight state, your physiology will override your intentions. The body sends powerful feedback to the brain. This is known as interoception, your brain's perception of internal bodily states. When your chest is tight, your shoulders are up, and your breath is fast, your brain doesn't just read that data passively, It interprets it as a confirmation of threat, and that creates a reinforcing loop. Stress in the body leads to stress in the brain, which leads to more reactivity in the body, unless you break the cycle. So, how do you stay physically calm when provoked? It begins with deliberate control over posture and breath. Keeping your body open, shoulders back, chin level, chest relaxed, sends a powerful message to your nervous system. There's no threat here. You're overriding the default defensive posture with a conscious signal of safety. And when you pair this with deep, slow exhalations, particularly exhaling longer than you inhale, you activate the parasympathetic system, which is the biological brake on anger. Another key is visual anchoring. When you're angry, your field of vision narrows, a phenomenon called visual tunneling, driven by heightened sympathetic arousal. You can counteract this by deliberately expanding your gaze. Look outward, widen your peripheral vision, and take in the environment around you. This subtle shift reduces limbic system activation and restores executive control. Your eyes aren't just passive, they're steering your state. Touch and physical grounding also play a role, lightly pressing your fingertips together, placing your palm flat on your thigh, or even feeling the weight of your feet on the ground. All of these actions engage mechanoreceptors that feed calming signals to the brain. These aren't tricks, they are sensory inputs that you control to shift your brain's interpretation of what's happening. Over time, the more you rehearse staying physically relaxed during low-level stress, the more automatic it becomes in high-stakes moments. You're conditioning your body to remain neutral, even when the environment is not. That's not suppression. It's regulation. Suppression is white-knuckling through emotion, which only builds tension. Regulation is precision, managing the input so the output aligns with who you want to be. And perhaps most importantly, physical calm is contagious. When you remain still, composed, and anchored, the other person's nervous system picks that up too. You change the emotional chemistry of the interaction, not by saying anything, but simply by being a stable reference point. You're not just protecting your peace, you're setting the tone for the environment. This isn't theoretical, it's biological leverage. When you master your physical state under pressure, you gain access to the clearest parts of your mind. You can hear what's being said without being hijacked by how it's said. You can choose not to engage. You can diffuse without reacting. And that's real strength, the kind that doesn't just feel calm but transmits it. Where you place your attention determines your internal state. This isn't metaphor, it's biology. Attention is not just a mental process, it's a neural act that drives which circuits in your brain become active and which ones quiet down. In the context of emotional control, especially when it comes to not getting angry or bothered by others, learning to direct your attention deliberately is one of the most powerful levers you have. When someone says something that stings, the natural tendency is to lock focus onto the perceived threat. This is an ancient survival response. Your brain evolved to detect danger, and social conflict, even if it's just a comment or facial expression, activates the same neural pathways that would have once warned you about a predator. The result? Your attention narrows. You fixate on the person, the words, the tone, you replay it, you add interpretation, and in doing so, you amplify the emotional response. But attention can also be used in the opposite direction. Instead of allowing it to be yanked toward the trigger, you can guide it somewhere else. That act of consciously choosing where to place your mental spotlight is what reestablishes control over your internal state. It's not about ignoring the moment. It's about regulating your physiological and cognitive response to it. The neural basis for this lies in the frontal and parietal cortices, regions that govern top-down attentional control. When you shift your focus, say, to the rhythm of your breath, the feel of your feet on the floor, or even a visual anchor in the room, you engage these regions and begin to deactivate the stress loop. You're telling your brain, this moment is not going to control me. I decide what matters right now. And here's where it gets more profound. The act of redirecting attention isn't just a distraction, it's training. Every time you do it, you're strengthening the neural networks responsible for self-regulation, impulse control, and executive function. You're building mental flexibility, the ability to move out of reactive states and into intentional ones. This becomes especially important in chronic stress environments or recurring interpersonal conflict. If someone in your life consistently tests your patience, you're not going to win by muscling through every encounter. You win by mastering the shift, by noticing when your attention is pulled toward anger or judgment, and then, without suppressing or denying, moving it toward something neutral or constructive. It might be a sensation, a mantra, a piece of music, or even a mental image of your ideal future self. That movement of attention is like a steering wheel. It's what keeps you from being driven by emotion. One practical tool here is using your visual field. When you're emotionally triggered, your focus tends to tunnel. But when you deliberately expand your gaze, widening it to take in more of your surroundings, you actually change the activity in your autonomic nervous system. It's not psychological, it's optical control over physiology. Your eyes are part of your brain, and when you use them to widen your perspective, you're signaling to the brain that you're not under immediate threat. That opens the door for rational thought to re-enter. Over time, this practice of attention control becomes not just a response, but a trait. You find yourself less drawn to drama, less reactive to tone, less easily pulled off center. It's not because you don't care, it's because you've trained your system to care on your terms, to choose what deserves your energy and what doesn't. And that level of self-direction, the ability to steer your own internal state in the middle of external chaos, is one of the most powerful forms of freedom a human can experience. Taking things personally is one of the most common sources of chronic stress and emotional dysregulation. It's also deeply biological. The brain is wired for social relevance, how others perceive us, how we're treated, whether we're included or excluded. These things carry a real physiological weight. But what often gets missed is this: most of what people say or do has very little to do with you. Their words, tone, body language, these are reflections of their internal state, their stress levels, wiring. If your system isn't trained to filter that, you absorb it as an attack. And when that happens, the brain flips into defense mode. There's a specific circuit in the brain called the default mode network. It's most active when you're thinking about yourself, your past, your future, how others perceive you. It's the narrative center. When someone says something dismissive, this network lights up. The mind starts creating stories, and they don't respect me, and I'm not good enough. Tense always happens. And those thoughts aren't just abstract. They activate the limbic system, trigger cortisol release, elevate heart rate, and prepare the body to either defend or collapse. This is what makes taking things personally so draining. It's not just about being offended. It's a full-body stress response tied to a perception of social threat. But here's the reframe. What people say reveals them, not you. The nervous system is a transmitter. If someone is reactive, rude, or cutting, it often means they're dysregulated. Their prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for emotional control, is offline. They're not assessing the full impact of their words. They're just leaking internal chaos. When you absorb that chaos and make it personal, you're not just misunderstanding the situation, you're taking on someone else's dysregulation as your own. You're allowing their state to hijack yours. To break that pattern, you need to create buffer, psychological distance. When someone lashes out, instead of interpreting it as a statement about your worth or identity, view it through a lens of curiosity. What's going on in their system right now that would lead them to speak that way? This isn't about excusing bad behavior. It's about refusing to let someone else's emotional instability dictate your neurochemical reality. This shift is neurobiological. When you pause and observe rather than react, you activate the prefrontal cortex and quiet the amygdala. You suppress the reactive reflex and enhance cognitive control. The more you practice this, the stronger those top-down circuits become. You're not suppressing your response. You're rewiring your interpretation of the stimulus. And over time, the same words that used to trigger a storm in your body become data points. Information, not invasion. Another factor is emotional memory. If you've been judged harshly in the past by family, teachers, peers, your nervous system will be hypersensitive to cues that resemble those past events. That's not weakness. That's survival circuitry. But you can retrain it. When you remind yourself, this is not the same moment and I am not the same person, you're disrupting the pattern. You're teaching your nervous system that the past doesn't own the present. And perhaps the most powerful thing to remember, not taking things personally is not detachment. It's precision. It means you still care, but you've learned how to care without being consumed. You've developed the ability to observe without absorbing. And that kind of control isn't robotic, it's regulated. It gives you the power to show up with compassion, strength, and clarity, even in the face of volatility. So the next time someone comes at you with judgment, sarcasm, or disrespect, take a breath. Feel your feet, widen your gaze, and remember, this moment is a reflection of their state, not your value. You are not obligated to carry someone else's storm. You are only responsible for your own signal. Choosing internal autonomy is a fundamental practice in creating emotional resilience and stability. It's the ability to govern your own emotional responses, thoughts, and actions, regardless of the external circumstances or the people around you. The concept rests on understanding the interplay between the external world and your internal state, and recognizing that while you can't control the world, you can control how you respond to it. This autonomy isn't just a mental exercise. It's deeply rooted in biology, and the more you train yourself in it, the more your body and mind work in harmony to maintain your emotional equilibrium. Every day, you encounter a myriad of external triggers, stressful situations at work, challenging interactions with family or friends, unexpected challenges in your personal life. These are the things that can throw you off balance, causing you to feel overwhelmed, anxious, or reactive. But what if, instead of letting these external events dictate your emotional state, you had the power to choose how you respond to them? Internal autonomy is the recognition that the power to regulate your emotional state is within you, not the environment or the people around you. At the core of internal autonomy is the understanding that your emotions and thoughts are not fixed. They are responses to stimuli that can be modulated. This is an important shift in perspective. The human brain is wired to be highly reactive. When you perceive a threat, whether physical or social, the brain automatically activates stress pathways, the fight or flight response. This is useful when faced with actual danger, but in everyday life, these automatic responses can lead to unnecessary stress, anxiety, and anger, especially when triggered by social interactions or perceived threats to your identity or well-being. Internal autonomy requires you to take a step back and assess these automatic responses. When something triggers an emotional reaction, your first instinct might be to immediately react, to feel hurt, angry, or frustrated. But with practice, you can learn to create a pause between the trigger and your response. In this space, you can decide how you want to react. This isn't about suppressing your feelings or pretending they don't exist. It's about gaining the ability to choose how to express and process them, instead of being at the mercy of the situation or someone else's behavior. The brain is highly plastic, meaning that with consistent practice, you can reshape how it responds to external stimuli. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for higher-level thinking, decision-making, and emotional regulation, can be trained to override more primitive, reactive brain circuits like the amygdala, which governs our emotional reactions. By practicing emotional regulation techniques, such as deep breathing, mindfulness, or simply taking a moment to observe your thoughts before reacting, you strengthen the prefrontal cortex's ability to manage your emotional responses. Over time, this process becomes more automatic, and you find yourself able to respond with greater calm and clarity in even the most stressful situations. One of the most powerful ways to cultivate internal autonomy is by consciously choosing where to direct your attention. The brain is constantly processing information, but it doesn't always process everything in a balanced or constructive way. When something triggers your emotions, the natural tendency is to focus on it, to dwell on it, to replay the conversation or event in your mind. This focus amplifies the emotional charge, reinforcing the feelings of anger, frustration, or fear. However, if you can intentionally redirect your attention to your breath, to your body, to your surroundings, or to a positive thought or mental image, you disrupt this cycle. This act of intentional focus shifts your brain's state and activates neural circuits that promote calm and clarity rather than reactivity and stress. Redirecting your attention is not just a mental exercise, it's also a physiological one. When you focus on your breath, for instance, you activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for calming the body and counteracting the stress response. Slow, deep breaths lower your heart rate, reduce the production of stress hormones like cortisol, and signal to your brain that you're not in danger. This physiological shift reinforces the cognitive shift. Your mind moves from reactive thinking to thoughtful response.